Joining me on today's podcast is Howell Williams. Howell is currently the Chief Development Officer with Keypath Education in Australia and has previously been Vice President of Client Management with the Learning House in Kentucky. Foremost an educator, Howell is passionate about and invested in transforming students' lives through education. As the Chief Development Officer for Australia, she plans, builds and launches online degree programs and divisions with university partners. Howell leads a team that evaluates potential degree programs, assesses institutional readiness for online learning and enrolment growth scale, project manages each of Keypath's functional areas and works to maintain robust relationships with partner institutions through the account management of these services. Welcome, Howell.
Thank you for having me today, for sure.
It's a pleasure. Now, Howell, you've previously been a student, you've been a faculty member, and now you have a much more corporate and collaborative partner lens when it comes to looking at student experience. Can you tell us a bit more about your work and the part that designing for student experience plays?
Sure. So I think we as a business, but myself professionally, is in a privileged spot because we get to connect the dots of the entire student life cycle and experience. And that's really across our entire business. So it's not just the classroom or not just prospective students, but the whole way through, and then once they graduate as well. But maybe perhaps I can tell you a little bit about the student population we serve to help ground what we're talking about in terms of experience.
That'd be great.
So at Keypath Education here in Australia, we primarily focus on the postgraduate online market and students. That means obviously working professionals. It doesn't mean master's research all the time, which is going to be a little bit interesting to talk about later. But working professionals that are adults, usually on a range of disciplines, from education and allied health to business and law to STEM-based and data and analytics programs, so across the board. Slightly more females than males. The average age is between 34 and 41. If we ask them about their academic confidence coming in, and these are postgraduate students, 1/3 would rate themselves having low academic confidence, which is kind of interesting. And overall, we know that they like to do their studies in chunks. So that typically we'll talk a little bit about short and small, but throughout their tenure, they can, and their educational tenure, rather take it in those small bites if possible. And mostly they want to get ahead in their career. We have a few career changers, people that are coming back to qualified degrees, for example, like social work or teaching, but mostly are those that are in their current profession that want to move up and are upskilling. Their lives are busy, as you know, they're time poor, and so we're designing for that. That really non-traditional, so to speak. And now they are the norm student, and I would say even your school leaver is not so traditional anymore. So yeah, we begin with that experience in mind, and that means everything from the product itself, the degree product. Does the value proposition of the degree, the outcomes that it promises, will it deliver on it, connected to industry particularly, and career advancement, all the way to the end of the student experience of graduation and their touch with our student success team. Did that work? And then the actual classroom experience in between that we're designed to. So happy to go into any of those areas to talk a little bit more, but I'll toss it back to you.
So I guess one of the other things, and it's really interesting hearing that because so much of what we focus on is really the undergraduate market.
Yeah.
And yet they're similar people that are transitioning over, and from the sounds of it, they're still having that lack of confidence. They're still having similar needs.
Sure. And I think that's really one of the most interesting parts that we, talking to our university partners. So we work with 8 different university partners, and really grounding them in and telling them who their own students are is a large part of what we do. To think about that throughout the design process. So this means, for example, all the way from a prospective student population, we're designing for that, how clear and concise the information is and how on demand it is, let's say about a potential degree like an MBA. Is it delivering what students are actually looking for and they're searching, and that's kind of UX experience, but it's student experience from them, right? And then to the point of the application phase, you know, I don't know if you've applied for a university lately, but it certainly hasn't gotten any easier. But we all in our daily lives use online forms or banking, visas, et cetera, that are much more simplified. And there's reasons for that at universities, whether it's macro forces like accreditation or data that has to be collected, but then there's just system problems. So we think about student experience from that design perspective, from prospective student experience as well. And that's an area to touch. And the undergraduate and graduate, postgraduate students experience that the same, right? Then once in the classroom, the actual virtual classroom, so to speak, the space that, I mean, this is most we talk about when we're talking about student experience, is their experience in the classroom. But I'm trying to make the point that it's kind of everything around it as well that influences that individual experience, which will be varied. But we do know through years of doing this that, you know, students within the classroom obviously have different ways of interacting with online materials. Their expectations are different. And so we have to design for all of that in mind and work backwards for it. Yeah, it's really interesting, and particularly the postgraduate level, because we often think of postgraduate as a lot of reading and writing and content, and that doesn't translate well when we're moving to kind of an activity-based learning design principles where we have to rethink how we're engaging the students in the classroom. And that teaching and learning part is really kind of the heart of what we do to shape the student experience and the feedback that comes from that.
And so much of what we know from a brain-based learning perspective is that reading stuff doesn't help you learn it. It's the other activities, it's the application, it's the practice and all those things. Yeah, so it's a different approach than we've had in the past.
Right, yeah. And so I think, again, back to that kind of privileged space that we get to listen to students, we get to talk to students, and we know them well, and then we get to implement that feedback with the universities on small scales and big scales. And interestingly enough, although we're talking about the online student population, what I love about what we do, it really transcends modalities. And so in my particular corporate space, the best compliment our business can get is when a university says, hey, we learned something from working with you all, we've applied it to our face-to-face course, or we've applied it to our admissions process now runs so much smoother. And so that's really kind of the work that we do in all those areas, and that's student experience throughout.
Which is really great. And I guess for you, you've worked both in the US market and the Australian higher education market. So could you share with us some of the different challenges and opportunities that exist, particularly when it comes to that online learning and that student experience? Because I know we come about things completely differently sometimes.
4 years here in Australia, and I am learning things still every day about those differences that are positive and challenging at the same time. I would first say that the online postgraduate student market is entirely different between the two continents. So there's a long history of professional postgraduate education in the US, largely going back to training folks on military bases or going to schools and teaching and these kind of professional degrees. Not so much in Australia. In the MBA was really the only thing for years. And so there's kind of introduction of professional rather than research-based postgraduate degrees here for a while. And I still think there's ways to go, to be honest. We can talk about the accreditation and the macro forces that are a part of that as people are looking to skill up within the jobs that they have. The motivations of students are quite different as well. It's still quite a bit of luxury to get a postgraduate education in Australia compared to sometimes a need to get ahead in the US, or even macro forces, like, again, back to the government saying, every teacher needs to have a master's degree in this state by X in the US, and that creates a market and demand. And obviously there are different forces in Australia as well. So that's different. Student expectations are different as well. We run a model with our university partners that's an accelerated academic calendar. which has been quite standard in the US for 20 years. It has 6 entry points a year, 7 to 8 week courses, 1 course at a time. We basically created that academic calendar here in Australia, and students are, it's a little fast pace for postgraduate online students. And even just thinking about 4 weeks of vacation in Australia versus not in the US, how do you work that into an academic calendar? So student pace and expectations are quite a bit different. We want to talk about retention comparisons between our US business and our Australian business. It's night and day. And we're done beating ourselves up over it. We just treat it a little bit differently here. That's a whole nother podcast, I think. Another difference is the governance processes, obviously, at institutions, and that affect student experience. So we can again go back to that degree product. Let's take a master of marketing degree. Let's say it needs to be reshaped or revamped to include digital, because that's what students are asking for now. Like, how fast can those approvals come through universities to change a degree product, to create it, et cetera, and that impacts the student experience throughout. Another area would probably just be the scale and size of Australian universities for online compared to the US. Working with roughly 40 universities in Australia. They're all very, very large and serving very diverse populations. International is a large part of that. And so it's just being able to adapt fast enough to serve an online postgraduate market that has very different needs in terms of systems, teaching and learning, expectations, when there's just as many other subgroups and populations at university that have different needs. And how do you pivot and scale to serve a diverse population? So I think, as I also say, some of the differences, I think some US universities, because of just the choice and the volume of universities, are able to specialize a little bit more in that sense. So the university says, we're going to focus on adult learners and postgraduate learners because our tuition depends on it. We don't have international students. We're going to invest in that a little bit more. So those are some of the high level differences. Some of the positives of the Australian market compared to the US with student experience are really that Australian universities are not afraid to partner with businesses like us that are outside of the space to make a difference. And I think it's really interesting for the ed tech space, but also services as well. There's a lot of great work going in to teaching and learning, and some tough conversations that are happening within universities to be able to serve students better, where the system is obviously research-based and that's rewarded. How do we talk a little bit more about how do we integrate good teaching and learning practices more? I would say if you want to be a learning designer in Australia, the market is wide open, and that directly impacts student experience. There's definitely more demand than supply for skilled educational or learning designers in this space, and I think we can impact the classroom there. And lastly, I think the other really opportunity for Australian online education is, again, to think global. What I mean by that primarily Southeast Asia, and the impact of the international student population, and how technology and modalities can be better leveraged.
And again, that then brings up other differences and other cultural things that you're dealing with. And it is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's definitely not this one size kind of fits all. If we're even just talking about that postgraduate market, which is getting actually younger and younger as well.
Great. And I understand that at Keypath, you do a lot of a significant amount of work in your ongoing data analysis, and part of that is about the assessment of the quality of online learning programs, but also understanding how your students are going to make sure that they gain the best possible learning experience. So can you tell us a bit more about how that works and how you use data to ensure that people are getting the best outcomes?
Yes, sure. We have a saying in the office that if it moves, we measure it. Or we attempt to measure it, I should say. But I guess backing up, it really comes down to step one of what we're defining as quality. as our business, what we know about the student experience, and then how we have agreed on that with our university partners. So that can be kind of a complicated area, but I think we have enough data and experience to at least have some benchmarks, and we always are in conversation with our partners about that. So maybe I'll think about it from, I can give you kind of the functional areas of how that data informs analysis and kind of the areas. Foremost, learning design. Agreeing on those quality principles is step one for us with our university partners, and we have our own rubric, so to speak, a course quality rubric that helps us frame that up. Others in the market have been around for years, Quality Matters, etc. But particularly for the postgraduate Australian space, we've customized it a bit. That gives us a benchmark, a place from which to talk with our faculties at universities, with our designing content writers and curators to be able to have at least a benchmark of what we're determining quality. So we measure against that every course that goes out. Again, it's not measuring teaching or facilitation, but a baseline quality for learning design and the course experience. Then everything outside of that, outside of that LMS or content management systems, are inputs that we can help measure and control, like melt rates from commencement to census for students, pass rates we measure, retention rates throughout the entire student experience, and curves and how those move. And then the university will always do student satisfaction within the actual individual courses that are both overall and at the teaching level. And that's really important that we have open conversations and dialogue about that student experience compared to all the data points that we have. So it's a combination of anecdotal and data. On the actual learning management system or learning outcome kind of data, I wish I could tell you that we had amazing learning analytics and there's some really great products and stuff going out there, but because we work within universities, we are the university and their LMSs, we are dependent on the kind of technologies that are used there. So there's basics, log in, log out, where students on the page, their interaction time, and there's some tools that we can put in there. I will tell you really one interesting kind of piece that's come out of our research the last year is that this assumption that in the online classroom, forums or dialogue, well-designed forums are where students kind of interact, and I think that's still primary. You get your experience even in MOOCs or other Udacity, other courses like that. But what we know is that by tracking the engagement with faculty outside of the classroom, we know that there's largely students measure and participation and logging in and logging out on forums has no corollary outcome to their success. But their engagement with their tutor or facilitator outside of the classroom is a predictor, which is not rocket science. It's pretty common, but the stuff that you can see is not always predictive of how students are behaved. It's really stuff outside of it that's occurring. So that's been really interesting for us to think about when we're designing courses and how we expect students to engage with facilitators, and how universities, how they contract facilitators and for how long and for how much, and how they monitor and help them in their own professional development. And so lastly, the kind of other data points we get are from our student success team that again are anecdotal, but we do have a proprietary risk factor analysis that takes in a bunch of inputs from things like time management, previous GPAs. There's lots of entry points or data points that help us pinpoint how we think the student might need more support or not.
That sounds really good, and I'm really interested in that whole concept, because we tend to measure what we can access, and measuring, how often people log in is relatively easy because the systems do that. Managing to monitor how often someone actually interacts with a person is a lot more difficult, and so then it becomes okay, well, how do we track that?
Right. Within the rules of engagement for employee agreements and expectations and all of that kind of stuff as well. But I mean, look, it's really, really interesting, and I think that's a huge area of opportunity, is in that role, or how we help shape what we expect with students, how we help teachers, right, in the online space, and what students expect. And putting obviously a full-time faculty member, that's a full professor in an online classroom, expecting 50 to 20 hours of engagement from that person a week, it's not a reality. But who can be there, or what other roles, technologies, or roles, or people do we put in place to support students? It's just a resource and time dynamic equals more success for students in our experience. So that means, even though a course might be self-paced, it doesn't mean that they want self-paced, or they like that. They want the interaction with humans, not just activities as well.
And it really comes back to everyone is human, and we try and measure things as if they're machines. Mm-hmm. So how do we get better at using the information or the data that is available to us to ensure that we are providing a positive learning experience? Is it changing the way we measure things, or is it changing the way we think about what we're measuring, or what can we do differently or better?
Yeah, I think constantly challenging our assumptions is where you started, because even ourselves have been in this online space for a decade. We think about the same thing in students' experience, and so even that forum example, although it's simple, it's like, why would we assume that throughout? So I think looking at new spaces and testing those assumptions, but really talking and listening to students. I know that seems so basic, but we always work with our university partners, and we actually have the same, to get back to basics, because the number one thing top three things I'll say that we know impacts student experience in our world, that engagement and that response, timely feedback from the facilitator or the tutor, that's number one. You can have a really well-designed course, but if number one doesn't happen, you're kind of off foot from the beginning. Another simple one, although easier said than done, is constructive alignment throughout a course, particularly related to authentic assessment. There's still too much disconnect between what students think they're learning, confirm that they're learning, and then what they're tested on. That's probably the number one thing that we focus on. It's also the most difficult at universities because of policy, because of assumptions. It's changing the way we measure students' success and their outcomes, ultimately they learn. And then the third area is really the students don't feel that it's applicable to their current roles, industry, and practical. That's where we get stuck. So no course in a postgraduate degree program labeled research is going to get number one. Like, we know that, right? The number one rating for student experience, right? But there are ways to fill in, research in the classic sense throughout a post-professional degree that is applicable and still rigorous, but it's just a different way of designing and thinking about it. So that's a long way to say that, and all of these, those are basics, and that's data that informs kind of each of those areas: the engagement of the facilitator, the results from assessment and student feedback, and then that area of did students get a job, and did they say they learned what they said they were going to learn? So for our space, there's so many levers to pull throughout this whole student life cycle. If we back up to even the prospective student, and that's what makes our work so exciting. Prioritizing those levers can be the challenge about where to start. And sometimes we constantly tell ourselves, having this data, and use the word big data, throw that around, and the anecdotal stuff as well, but getting back to the basics of what really kind of influences students, giving them no choice but to learn, right? That's a really tricky one, because students could have a really bad experience, but they can learn a ton, right? So again, defining those tensions and living with them, and being open to, we don't always know what's right.
That's really great. And I guess, I mean, for me, that's all the questions that I had. Is there anything else that you'd like to share while we have you here?
No, I just really I thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to dialogue about this space. And I think the more people thinking about it and doing and testing, and also how universities can think about the online space in a short course and training sphere, and how that's going to influence the next generation of what they're expecting in the space. It's going to change rapidly, and it is changing rapidly, and us being able to adapt as educators and institutions is paramount in this space.
Yeah, we do need to shift away from that industrial age education mindset and into something that's much more fluid and adaptive. And I think I like the idea of the 7 entry point intense, one subject at a time kind of concept. But it's going to be interesting to see how people's mindsets shift to adapt to different approaches, both as students and also as academics. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. It's been really insightful and I've loved having you here.
Thanks for having me. Talk to you soon.